If you don't like how I live, leave. Those words hit me like a slap across the face, but instead of arguing back, I just nodded and walked away. Sometimes the most honest thing someone can tell you is exactly what you need to hear, even when it destroys everything you thought you were building together. I'd been dating Kendra for 3 years, watching our relationship slowly transform from something genuine into whatever this had become. I'm Drew, 29, and I work as a network security analyst for a mid-sized tech company here in Atlanta. I'm the kind of guy who believes in showing up consistently, building something real brick by brick, and treating commitments like they actually matter. Kendra used to appreciate that about me, or at least I thought she did. She worked as a receptionist at one of those upscale fitness centers in Buckhead, the kind of place where membership costs more than most people's rent and everyone drives cars worth more than my annual salary. That's where she met Trent, a fitness instructor who specialized in making everything look effortless while being the center of attention. I'd noticed the change in her behavior over the past few months, the way she'd started coming home later and later, always with stories about after-work gatherings and group activities that somehow never included me. When I'd suggest we spend an evening together, she'd roll her eyes and tell me I didn't understand her need for social connections and networking opportunities. That particular night, I'd finally worked up the courage to address what felt like her growing distance from our relationship. I told her I missed the time we used to spend together, that I felt like I barely saw her anymore except when she needed something from me. She'd looked at me with this expression that was equal parts irritation and condescension, like I was some needy child who couldn't understand basic adult concepts. She explained that Trent and the other trainers were going to this exclusive rooftop bar downtown, the kind of place with bottle service and velvet ropes, and that these connections were important for her future. When I asked why I couldn't come along, she laughed in a way that made me feel small and told me I wouldn't fit in with that crowd anyway. That's when she delivered those final words about leaving if I didn't like her lifestyle, grabbed her purse, and headed out the door without looking back. I stood in our apartment for maybe 10 minutes after she left, just listening to the silence and finally understanding what had been happening. This wasn't a rough patch or a misunderstanding we could work through. This was her telling me exactly where I ranked in her priorities, and it wasn't anywhere close to the top. Instead of waiting around for her to come home so we could have another circular argument about respect and communication, I did something that surprised even me. I walked to our bedroom closet, pulled out my old military-style backpack and a large duffel bag, and began methodically packing everything that truly belonged to me. 3 years of shared living had somehow condensed down to remarkably few possessions that were actually mine. Clothes, electronics, books, a few sentimental items from my family, my collection of vintage computer equipment that Kendra had always complained took up too much space. Everything fit into those 2 bags with room to spare, which struck me as either pathetic or liberating, depending on how I chose to look at it. I moved through the apartment systematically, making sure I wasn't taking anything that belonged to her or that we'd purchased together. I left the furniture, the kitchen appliances, the decorative items she'd insisted on buying, even the expensive coffee maker I'd paid for but she'd chosen. I wanted a clean break, no reasons for her to contact me later claiming I'd stolen something or owed her money. The only thing I took from our shared life was my portion of the security deposit, which I figured I'd earned by actually paying rent consistently for 3 years. I wrote her a note, nothing dramatic or emotional, just stating that I was taking her advice and leaving since I clearly didn't fit into the life she wanted to live. I told her she could keep everything in the apartment and that I'd transferred my portion of our shared savings account to a new account she couldn't access. I left my key to the apartment on the kitchen counter next to the note, shouldered my bags, and walked out of what had been our shared life for the last time. When Kendra came home at 3 in the morning, probably expecting to find me either waiting up to apologize or sulking in the bedroom so she could continue our argument, she instead found empty closets and the reality of what her words had actually accomplished. According to our mutual friend Jessica, who called me weeks later, Kendra had initially thought I was playing some kind of dramatic game to get her attention. The idea that I would actually leave without a fight, without begging her to reconsider, without giving her the satisfaction of a big emotional scene, had apparently never occurred to her. She'd spent that first night calling and texting frantically, demanding to know where I was and when I was coming back to discuss things like adults. But my phone was already on airplane mode, sitting in my glove compartment as I drove through the night toward a new life that didn't include waiting around for someone to decide I was worth their time. Looking back, I can see exactly where things started to go wrong, though at the time I thought we were building something meaningful together. Kendra and I met during our senior year at Georgia Tech through a campus volunteer program for animal rescue, one of those weekend events where students would help organize adoption fairs and fundraising activities for local shelters. I'd signed up because I genuinely loved animals and believed in the cause, while Kendra had joined because she was planning to apply to veterinary school and wanted relevant experience on her applications. We worked well together from the start, my methodical approach to organizing events and managing logistics complementing her natural ability to connect with potential pet owners and make them feel comfortable around nervous rescue animals. She had this way of talking to people that made them trust her immediately, explaining pet care requirements and adoption procedures with genuine enthusiasm that convinced even hesitant families to open their homes to animals who needed them. I admired her passion for veterinary medicine and her dream of eventually opening her own practice focused on rescue animal rehabilitation. After graduation, reality hit us both pretty hard in different ways. I'd been fortunate enough to land a network security position with a solid starting salary and signing bonus, while Kendra struggled to find anything in her field and ended up taking a receptionist job at an upscale fitness center in Buckhead just to pay bills while she figured out her next steps. I used my signing bonus to secure us a nice apartment in Midtown Atlanta, reasoning that having a stable living situation would give her the breathing room she needed to focus on her veterinary school applications and weekend certification programs. I covered most of our shared expenses during those early months, from rent to groceries to the costs associated with her continuing education courses in pet therapy and animal behavior. It felt like an investment in our shared future, and Kendra seemed grateful for the support, often talking about how she'd pay me back once she got into veterinary school and started earning a real income. For the first year after graduation, our relationship felt solid and purposeful, built around quiet evenings when she'd study for her certification exams while I worked on side projects to advance my cybersecurity skills. We'd cook dinner together, watch documentaries about animal conservation, plan weekend trips to visit different rescue organizations around Georgia, and dream about the veterinary practice she'd run someday with me handling the business and technology aspects. I thought we were a team working toward complementary goals that would eventually merge into something bigger than either of us could accomplish alone. The change started gradually, so subtle at first that I convinced myself I was imagining things. Kendra began spending more time at the gym after her shifts ended, initially claiming she was networking with members who might become clients once she opened her practice. She'd come home with stories about the trainers and their elaborate social lives, the expensive cars they drove, the exclusive events they attended, the adventurous lifestyle that seemed so different from our quiet evenings at home. Trent's name started appearing in her conversations more frequently, always in the context of his latest exciting activity or spontaneous adventure. He was apparently the kind of person who organized midnight rock climbing expeditions, impromptu beach trips to the Gulf Coast, and exclusive parties at rooftop venues I'd never heard of but that cost more to enter than I spent on groceries in a month. At first, I tried to be supportive of her expanding social circle, figuring that making connections in Atlanta was important for someone trying to build a career in a competitive field. When she'd mention Trent's latest adventure or show me photos from their group activities on social media, I'd express interest and ask questions, genuinely trying to understand this part of her life that seemed to energize her in ways our quiet relationship apparently didn't. But gradually, I started noticing that these conversations always ended with subtle criticisms of our lifestyle, comments about how predictable our routines had become, how we never did anything spontaneous or exciting anymore. She began comparing everything we did to the adventures Trent organized for his social circle, pointing out how much more interesting his approach to life was compared to our careful planning and budgeting. Our cozy nights planning her future clinic became interruptions keeping her from more important social obligations, and the weekend rescue volunteering that had brought us together became something she was too busy to prioritize anymore. The final months of our relationship felt like watching something I'd carefully built slowly collapse in front of me, brick by brick, while being told I was imagining the destruction. Kendra's criticism of my lifestyle became more frequent and pointed, always framed as helpful observations about how I could improve myself or become more interesting. She'd tell me that my idea of adventure was trying a new restaurant, that my weekend plans were predictable and boring, that successful people like Trent knew how to live spontaneously and embrace excitement instead of planning everything to death. When I'd suggest we try some of the activities she found so appealing, she'd explain that I wouldn't understand the social dynamics involved or that I'd feel out of place among her new friends who were more sophisticated and worldly than my usual crowd. I started feeling like a stranger in my own relationship, constantly being measured against standards I hadn't agreed to and found lacking in ways I couldn't quite understand. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in March when I discovered that Kendra had used the money I'd given her for veterinary school application fees to fund a weekend getaway to Savannah with her gym friends. I'd specifically set aside $1,200 to cover application costs for 3 schools she'd claimed were her top choices, money that represented a significant chunk of my monthly budget after covering our shared expenses. When I asked her about the application deadlines she'd mentioned, she became evasive and defensive, eventually admitting that she'd decided to postpone veterinary school for another year to focus on exploring other opportunities. The Savannah trip photos on her social media told a different story, showing her and Trent along with several other trainers staying at an expensive beachfront resort, dining at high-end restaurants, and participating in activities that clearly cost far more than the application money could have covered. When I confronted her that evening about the misused money and what felt like a fundamental betrayal of our shared goals, she accused me of being controlling and obsessive about finances, claiming that Trent had helped her realize she was too young to lock herself into such a rigid life plan. She told me that veterinary school would always be there, but opportunities to experience life and build meaningful connections were fleeting, and that successful people understood the importance of networking and relationship building over academic credentials. The argument escalated when I pointed out that she'd essentially stolen money intended for her education to fund a vacation with another man, which she dismissed as a narrow-minded way of looking at investment in her personal development and social capital. She explained that Trent understood her need for excitement and adventure, that he encouraged her to think bigger and take risks instead of playing it safe like I always did, and that maybe she was starting to realize we wanted fundamentally different things from life. That's when she delivered her ultimatum about leaving if I didn't like her lifestyle choices, grabbed her purse, and headed out to meet Trent and his friends at some exclusive rooftop bar downtown that charged cover fees higher than what most people spent on entertainment in a month. After she left, I sat in our apartment for about 10 minutes, listening to the silence and finally understanding that this wasn't a rough patch we could work through or a misunderstanding that could be resolved with better communication. This was her telling me exactly who she'd decided to become and where I fit into that vision, which was nowhere at all. I realized that the woman I'd fallen in love with, the one who dreamed of helping rescue animals and building something meaningful together, had been replaced by someone who saw our relationship as an obstacle to the exciting life she deserved. Instead of waiting for her to come home at whatever hour so we could have another circular argument about respect and priorities, I made a decision that surprised even me with its clarity and finality. I walked to our bedroom, pulled out my old military backpack and duffel bag, and began systematically packing everything that belonged to me, which turned out to be remarkably little after 3 years of shared living. I moved through the apartment methodically, taking only what was genuinely mine and leaving behind everything we'd purchased together or that she'd chosen for our shared space. I transferred my portion of our shared savings to a new account, wrote a brief note explaining that I was taking her advice and leaving, left my apartment key on the kitchen counter, and drove 6 hours through the night to Charlotte where my college roommate Marcus had repeatedly offered his guest room if I ever needed to get away. I kept my phone on airplane mode for the entire drive and the week that followed, needing complete radio silence to process what felt like the death of not just our relationship but the entire future I thought we were building together. While I was in Charlotte trying to rebuild my sense of self-worth and figure out what came next, Kendra was apparently making decisions that would prove just how poorly she understood the difference between excitement and stability. According to Jessica, who eventually filled me in on the details months later, Kendra had initially panicked when she realized I'd actually left and wasn't coming back to continue our argument or beg her to reconsider. She'd spent that first week calling me obsessively and enlisting mutual friends to track me down, convinced that I was playing some kind of dramatic game to get her attention. When it became clear that I was serious about ending our relationship, she'd apparently decided that the best way to prove she'd made the right choice was to immediately move in with Trent, thinking his adventurous lifestyle was exactly what she'd been missing during our 3 years together. The reality of Trent's situation turned out to be quite different from the image he projected on social media and during their group outings to expensive venues. Jessica told me that within the first week of living together, Kendra discovered that Trent was thousands of dollars in debt from purchasing extreme hobby gear and maintaining the appearance of a lifestyle he couldn't actually afford. His rock climbing equipment, mountain bikes, kayaks, and other adventure accessories were all financed through credit cards and personal loans he'd been juggling for years, while his actual income from personal training sessions barely covered his basic living expenses. The expensive outings that had impressed Kendra so much were funded through a combination of credit card advances and carefully managed social situations where other people picked up the majority of the costs while Trent contributed just enough to maintain his reputation as someone who belonged in those circles. More problematic than his financial irresponsibility was Trent's personality when he wasn't performing for an audience of potential clients and social media followers. The charming, confident fitness instructor who organized exciting group adventures turned out to have a volatile temper that emerged whenever he felt stressed or challenged, particularly around money and his living situation. When Kendra had impulsively quit her gym job, expecting Trent to support her while she figured out her next career move, he'd initially seemed agreeable but quickly became resentful about carrying the financial burden of their shared expenses. He began pressuring her to find work immediately while simultaneously criticizing her job search efforts and suggesting that her previous relationship had made her too comfortable with being financially dependent on others. The emotional abuse escalated gradually, with Trent alternating between affectionate attention when things were going well and cruel dismissiveness whenever external stresses affected his mood. He'd tell Kendra she was being clingy and needy when she tried to have conversations about their relationship or future plans, explaining that successful people focused on living in the moment rather than constantly analyzing and planning every aspect of their lives. When she'd express concern about their financial situation or suggest they needed to budget more carefully, he'd accuse her of being materialistic and shallow, claiming that her previous relationship had corrupted her understanding of what really mattered in life. The situation reached a crisis point about 2 months into their living arrangement when Trent's carefully managed social facade finally collapsed under the weight of his accumulated debts and poor decisions. He'd been using Kendra's credit cards to cover expenses while promising to pay her back from upcoming personal training contracts that never materialized, and when she confronted him about the mounting balances, he'd exploded in a rage that terrified her. The argument had escalated to property damage when he'd thrown her laptop across their apartment, shattering the screen and destroying work she'd been doing on freelance marketing projects to contribute to their expenses. Neighbors had called building management about the noise, and when Kendra threatened to involve the police over the destroyed property, Trent had told her to get out and never come back, claiming she was too high maintenance and dramatic for someone who understood how to live freely and authentically. The final humiliation came when Kendra discovered that Trent had been maintaining casual relationships with multiple women from his fitness classes throughout their entire living arrangement, something that became obvious when one of them showed up at their apartment expecting to spend the night and seemed genuinely surprised to discover that someone else was living there. The confrontation that followed revealed that Trent had been telling other women that Kendra was just a temporary roommate helping him through a financial rough patch, and that his real relationships were with people who understood his need for independence and adventure rather than traditional commitment and exclusivity. Kicked out with nowhere else to turn and her credit cards maxed out from covering Trent's expenses, Kendra had been forced to call her estranged sister in Birmingham and ask for emergency shelter, a conversation that apparently involved a lot of crying and admissions about how badly she'd misjudged both Trent's character and the value of what she'd walked away from when she'd chosen excitement over stability. While Kendra's life was imploding in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, I was discovering that losing someone who didn't value what I offered actually created space for building something much better. My week in Charlotte with Marcus turned into a month of genuine healing and self-reflection, helped enormously by his perspective as someone who'd known me since college and could remind me of who I was before I'd spent 3 years trying to be enough for someone who had fundamentally different values. Marcus encouraged me to join his local cycling club, which introduced me to a group of people who appreciated steady commitment and shared goals rather than constant excitement and validation. The rhythm of training rides and weekend cycling adventures gave me a healthy outlet for processing my emotions while building genuine friendships with people who valued reliability and mutual support. I also started playing competitive chess at a local club, something I'd enjoyed in college but had abandoned when Kendra complained that it was too boring and antisocial for someone my age. The strategic thinking required for chess helped me understand my relationship patterns and recognize how I'd gradually compromised my own interests trying to accommodate someone who saw compromise as weakness rather than partnership. After 2 months in Charlotte, I'd gained enough clarity about what I actually wanted from life to make some major changes that felt exciting rather than scary. My company had been moving toward more remote work arrangements, and when I requested a permanent work-from-home setup, they agreed immediately, recognizing my consistent performance and reliability as an employee. This gave me the freedom to relocate anywhere with good internet connectivity, and I chose Austin, Texas, partly for the thriving tech scene but mostly because it felt like a place where I could build the kind of life I actually wanted rather than the life someone else expected me to live. I found a small house in a quiet neighborhood with enough space for a proper home office and a workshop where I could pursue my interest in vintage computer restoration, something Kendra had always complained took up too much space and served no practical purpose. The house came with a decent-sized yard where I could eventually get a dog, another long-term goal that had been indefinitely postponed during my relationship because Kendra preferred the flexibility of not having pet responsibilities. More importantly, Austin offered opportunities to reconnect with my original passion for helping animals through volunteer work at local shelters, something that had brought genuine meaning to my life before I'd gotten distracted trying to fund someone else's dreams. The animal shelter where I started volunteering introduced me to Rachel, a veterinary resident who was completing her final year of training at the University of Texas. She was everything Kendra had claimed to want to become but never actually worked toward: dedicated, knowledgeable, genuinely passionate about animal welfare, and completely committed to building a career around helping animals rather than just talking about it. Rachel appreciated my systematic approach to shelter operations and my technical skills for managing their volunteer coordination database, while I admired her expertise and genuine compassion for animals who'd been abandoned or mistreated. Our friendship developed naturally around shared weekend activities like bird watching at local nature preserves and visiting farmers markets where we'd buy ingredients for quiet dinners spent discussing her veterinary cases and my cybersecurity projects. She found my steady, reliable nature refreshing rather than boring, often commenting that she'd never dated anyone who actually followed through on plans or showed up consistently without drama or complications. The contrast with my previous relationship was so stark that I sometimes wondered if I'd imagined how exhausting and demoralizing those 3 years with Kendra had actually been. I also started therapy during this period, partly to understand why I'd tolerated Kendra's treatment for so long and partly to make sure I didn't repeat the same patterns in future relationships. My therapist helped me recognize how I'd gradually absorbed the message that my natural personality traits were flaws that needed to be overcome rather than strengths that the right person would value and appreciate. Learning to establish better boundaries and recognize my own worth became essential preparation for building a healthy relationship with someone who actually wanted to be with me rather than someone who saw me as a temporary solution to their financial problems while they pursued more exciting options. As my life in Austin continued to improve and stabilize around genuine relationships and meaningful work, Kendra's situation in Birmingham was apparently deteriorating in ways that forced her to confront the reality of choices she'd made impulsively without considering long-term consequences. According to updates I received through our mutual friend network, her stay with her sister had started badly and gotten progressively worse as months passed without any improvement in her financial or emotional stability. Her sister had initially offered emergency shelter out of family obligation, but Kendra's inability to contribute meaningfully to household expenses or take responsibility for rebuilding her life had created ongoing tension that eventually became unsustainable. She'd struggled to find steady employment due to significant gaps in her resume and poor references from her impulsive departure from the gym job, while her mounting credit card debt from covering Trent's expenses made it impossible to afford independent housing even with entry-level work. More problematic than her financial situation was her apparent inability to accept responsibility for the decisions that had led to her circumstances, instead crafting elaborate narratives about being victimized by manipulative men and unfair economic systems that prevented hardworking people from achieving stability. About 6 months after the Trent disaster, Kendra began what Jessica described as a systematic campaign to win me back, starting with carefully curated social media posts designed to suggest she'd learned from her mistakes and was refocusing on her original veterinary goals. She posted photos of herself volunteering at animal shelters in Birmingham, reading veterinary textbooks, and engaging in wholesome activities that bore no resemblance to the party lifestyle she'd pursued during our final months together. The posts included captions about personal growth, learning to value stability over excitement, and discovering what really mattered in life through difficult experiences that had taught her important lessons about character and priorities. When these indirect attempts to get my attention failed to generate any response, she escalated to enlisting mutual friends as intermediaries, claiming she'd been in an emotionally abusive situation with Trent and needed to reconnect with people who genuinely cared about her well-being. She asked Jessica and others to pass along messages about her regret and desire to make amends, emphasizing that she'd finally understood the difference between genuine love and superficial attraction. She even contacted my family members, including my mother, with elaborate stories about being trapped in a dangerous relationship and needing help from people who'd known her during happier times. The manipulation became more obvious when she started asking these same family members for my contact information and new address, claiming she needed closure and the opportunity to apologize properly for mistakes she'd made during a difficult period in her life. Her sister eventually asked her to leave Birmingham after Kendra's increasingly erratic behavior and financial demands became too much to handle, particularly when she'd started bringing home men she'd met through dating apps and expecting to use the guest room for overnight visits without contributing anything to household expenses or helping with basic chores and responsibilities. Forced to return to Atlanta with no clear plan for housing or employment, Kendra apparently spent weeks couch surfing with various acquaintances while crafting increasingly desperate schemes to restore some version of her previous lifestyle. She managed to find irregular work through temp agencies, but her poor attitude and unreliable attendance made it impossible to secure permanent positions that would have provided the stability she needed to rebuild her life independently. Through social media detective work that bordered on stalking, she discovered that I'd relocated to Austin and was apparently thriving in a new environment, information that seemed to trigger an obsessive fixation on the idea that winning me back would solve all her current problems. She began developing what she described to friends as a plan for a grand romantic gesture that would demonstrate her commitment to changing and her understanding of what she'd lost when she'd chosen excitement over stability. The plan involved traveling to Austin to surprise me with evidence of her personal growth and renewed dedication to the veterinary goals we'd originally shared, convinced that seeing her effort and dedication would remind me of why we'd been good together and inspire me to give our relationship another chance. She spent months crafting an elaborate narrative about therapy, self-discovery, and learning to appreciate the value of genuine partnership over superficial attraction, apparently believing that the right combination of words and gestures would erase the memory of how she'd treated me during our final months together and the cruel dismissal that had ended our relationship. 3 years after I'd walked out of our apartment with nothing but 2 bags and my dignity intact, I was living the kind of life I'd always wanted but had never quite believed was possible during those final months with Kendra when everything felt like an uphill battle against someone else's expectations. My work in Austin had evolved beyond anything I'd imagined, with my company promoting me to lead a cybersecurity consulting team that allowed me to travel occasionally while maintaining the home base I'd built in Texas. Rachel had completed her veterinary residency and accepted a position at a progressive animal hospital that specialized in rescue rehabilitation, which meant we could finally start making concrete plans for the future we'd been discussing during our 2 years together. We'd gotten engaged 6 months earlier in the most perfectly understated way possible, during a quiet evening at home when our conversation about adopting a second dog had naturally evolved into talking about buying a house together and what we wanted our shared life to look like in 5 years. I'd proposed with a ring I'd chosen specifically for her rather than trying to impress anyone else, and she'd said yes while laughing about how much more practical and meaningful our approach to major decisions was compared to the dramatic relationship stories her single friends always shared. My company's annual outdoor barbecue was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in late spring, one of those perfect Austin days when the weather made it impossible to believe anywhere else could be better for building a life worth living. I'd been looking forward to introducing Rachel to some colleagues she hadn't met and showing off the collaborative team culture that made my work environment so different from the corporate environments where politics and image mattered more than actual competence and reliability. I was standing near the grilling area, talking with my team lead about a new project that would involve consulting with animal hospitals on data security protocols, when I noticed a woman approaching our group with the kind of determined stride that suggested she was on a mission rather than casually mingling. It took me a moment to recognize Kendra, partly because she looked so different from the confident, polished woman who'd dismissed our relationship 3 years earlier, and partly because seeing her in Austin felt so completely surreal that my brain struggled to process her actual presence at my workplace event. She was thinner than I remembered, with an anxious energy that made her movements seem forced and unnatural, wearing what looked like an expensive outfit that didn't quite fit right and suggested she'd been trying to recreate her old image of success and sophistication. When she spotted me, her face went through a series of expressions that revealed exactly how unprepared she was for this moment despite having presumably planned it for months, surprise giving way to nervous determination as she realized there was no backing out of whatever speech she'd rehearsed for this encounter. I calmly introduced her to my colleagues as someone I used to know from Atlanta, keeping my tone politely neutral in a way that clearly communicated this was not someone significant in my current life, while she stood there looking increasingly uncomfortable as she realized her grand romantic gesture was playing out in front of witnesses who had no context for the drama she'd apparently expected to unfold. Before she could launch into whatever prepared speech she'd brought with her, Rachel appeared at my side with 2 plates of food, kissed me warmly in the natural way of someone who belonged exactly where she was, and smiled at Kendra with the kind of genuine friendliness that comes from complete security and confidence in your relationship. The introduction of Rachel as my wife, which still felt wonderfully surreal to say even though we'd been married for just 2 months, seemed to hit Kendra like a physical blow that drained all the nervous energy from her posture and left her looking smaller and more lost than I'd ever seen her. I watched her process the reality of what she was seeing: my wedding ring, Rachel's obvious comfort and belonging in my life, the easy affection between us that spoke to years of building something real together, and the complete absence of any space for her in the life she'd apparently traveled across several states to reclaim. The moment stretched into awkward silence as Kendra struggled to adjust her expectations and find some way to salvage her planned confrontation, while Rachel continued chatting pleasantly about the barbecue and her excitement about meeting people from my work that she'd heard me mention in stories about my daily life. I realized that this encounter was crystallizing everything Kendra had lost when she'd chosen excitement over stability and everything I'd gained by walking away from someone who couldn't appreciate what I offered. Standing there watching her try to process the reality of my happiness with someone who valued exactly the qualities she'd found boring and predictable, I felt a combination of sympathy for her obvious distress and gratitude for the painful lesson that had ultimately led me to build something infinitely better with someone who actually wanted to share a life with me. When Kendra finally managed to speak, she stumbled through a brief comment about being happy to see me doing well, her voice barely above a whisper as she realized that the Drew she'd left behind no longer existed and had been replaced by someone who'd moved completely beyond any need for her approval or presence. I responded with genuine kindness but unmistakable finality, wishing her well in finding her own path and making it clear that this chapter of my life was permanently closed, before walking away hand in hand with Rachel toward the group of friends and colleagues who represented my actual community and support system. As we moved away, I could feel Kendra watching us with the kind of desperate intensity that comes from understanding too late that some decisions can't be undone and some opportunities, once rejected, never come around again. Later that evening, as Rachel and I sat in our backyard discussing wedding plans for her sister's upcoming ceremony and laughing about how smoothly our day had gone despite the unexpected drama, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed from those dark months when I'd felt like I wasn't enough for someone who'd never deserved what I was offering. The contrast between Kendra's desperation and Rachel's contentment, between the anxiety of trying to convince someone to value you and the peace of being with someone who already does, made me profoundly grateful for every difficult moment that had led me to understand my own worth and find someone who celebrated rather than criticized the person I actually was.